Welcome everyone to this lockdown panel on The Encounter, an extraordinary, conceptually adventurous theatrical experience, seen in its streamed form this last week by over 70,000 people around the world. It's a play created by the very great Simon McBurney and the Complicité Theatre. Before we kick off, I just want to raise a few Zoom keeping or housekeeping matters. If you'd like captions to the event, you can activate them on your screen at the bottom. There's a little box there. I should also mention that this event is being recorded and will be live streamed on Facebook. We've left a good half hour for your questions at the end of the panel, so please just type them into your Q&A box on the screen. If we don't get to your question, we apologize in advance. There are some 1,700 of us here. That's twice the number of the indigenous people whom you have seen in this play. So I hope you'll understand. The encounter takes us deep into the Amazon, as well as deep into the human mind in its many possible configurations. It's a story about an encounter with the indigenous Kwikoro people of the Amazon and their ways of living and experiencing nature, consciousness, and ritual. It's also a play about listening in its many guises, and it takes in thought transfers to many more intimate domestic forms of that, something we really need during lockdown. Crucially, because of all of this, the encounter opens us up to imagining new beginnings, perhaps new ways of thinking post-COVID, which has taught us so many things already. It also gives us an opportunity to come together and help the Amazon rainforest and its indigenous communities who have been increasingly under pressure under Bolsonaro and with the COVID pandemic. So just to say, I'm Lisa Appignanesi. I'm a writer, sometimes of fiction, but also of various histories of madness and the workings of the mind. Most recently, the book called Everyday Madness, about grief and anger and loss. We're going to go around the room now, and everybody is going to introduce themselves, and we'll finish with Simon, who will then tell us a little bit about why he's doing this particular encounter online. So, Takuma, tell us who you are. Introduce yourself.
Tá bom, Takuma. A palavra está com você, tá? Pode se apresentar.
Tá. Eu sou Takuma.
So my name is Takuma. I'm from the Kwikoro people.
Eu estou aqui na minha aldeia, participando desse evento maravilhoso com vocês.
I'm here in my village, and it's wonderful to be here with you.
Então, eu moro na aldeia Ipatse. Eu sou do povo Kwikoro, na terra indígena de Xingu.
I live in a village called Ipatse. I'm from the Kwikoro people, and our village is in the indigenous territories of the Xingu in Brazil.
Eu sou cineasta, eu trabalho com audiovisual aqui na comunidade junto com o meu povo.
I'm a filmmaker. I make films with my people, the Kwikoro people.
Paul, since you've been...
Então, é isso. Eu sou daqui mesmo, da aldeia Ipatse, né? E estamos aqui no meio da crise mundial, né? Crise que está afetando o mundo, e estamos fazendo isolamento aqui dentro da nossa aldeia mesmo, dentro da nossa casa. Nossa casa é nossa terra indígena do Xingu.
So we're here in the middle of this global pandemic, but where are we? We're in our village. We're isolated, but we're here in our village, which is in the center of the Xingu. And when I talk about we're at home, I mean our home is this forest. Our home are these Xingu indigenous territories. Obrigado, Takuma. Thank you, Takuma.
Thank you so much. Paul, will you tell us a little about yourself now? You're here not only in your role as translator.
Yes, I'm Professor of Drama and Performance and Director of People's Palace Projects, which is a research centre at Queen Mary, University of London. But I'm speaking from today, not from the Mile End Road, but from Rio de Janeiro in a place called Casa Rio, which is a centre for artists, residency centre, where Takuma and his fellow artists from the Kwikuru. I've stayed many times, so it's great to be here with you.
Thank you. Charlotte.
Hello, everyone. I'm speaking to you from the east coast of England, where it's a beautiful day. And my name is Charlotte Ducan. I'm a writer, an editor, and co-director of the Dark Mountain Project, which is a network of writers and artists responding to the collapse of our ecology, our social systems, and a search for stories that might serve us in this time of transition.
Thank you. Simon.
Hello, everybody. I'm speaking to you from my home just outside Stroud in Gloucestershire. Thank you so much for coming, everybody. And I know that because I can see that a lot of you are just joining now. So just to recap, that you will see Lisa Appignanesi, who is chairing this discussion again, Charlotte Ducan, writer and editor and teacher and part of the Black Mountain Project, Paul Heritage, who is professor of drama at Queen Mary, and he is speaking to you from Brazil and also translating for Takuma Kwikuru, who's speaking to you from the Xingu indigenous territory in Mato Grosso in Brazil. In Brazil, I believe it's early afternoon. And just one thing, Lisa did say that in the encounter, and I'm just going to kick off talking about that, if that's all right, Lisa. Was saying that was saying an encounter with the Kwikuru people. I just want to correct that tiny mistake, because it's in fact the Mairuna people in the Javari Valley, and the Kwikuru people are further east in Mato Grosso. However, currently the difficulties or the challenges and the struggle going on for indigenous people is, of course, Amazon-wide. So all of these things apply to different people. So I just want to talk a little bit, say the encounter. I'm the director. If you've seen the show, of course, I'm also performing. And I wanted to say that although you see me alone on stage, in fact, it's a piece made by many, many people. It was the principal story was taken from a book by the Romanian writer Petru Popescu, who could well be tuning in Los Angeles right now. If he is, hello Petru, whose story is almost as remarkable as Lauren McIntyre's, how he escaped the Ceausescu regime and came and started a new career in the United States. But there are many people who made the show. The Extraordinary Sound, made by Gareth Fry and Pete Malkin, and the fact that it was originally produced by in my company by Judith Dimmant, and I also worked very closely with my co-director Kirsty Housley. So, but those are just a small number. Behind these screens are also my own company, Complicité, without whom this wouldn't be happening. And the reason that we wanted to put the encounter back on screen was because, or to share it with you, to try and recreate something of the experience, is the fact that some of the themes, if you like, which we'll talk about in a bit, seemed to resonate with this very time. I'm not a particular fan of theatre in a flat screen on a streaming. Why? Because, well, in the theatre you can't actually get up and go. You can't stop it. You can't rewind it. You can't start all over again. You're there. You have to submit yourself to the time of the theatre, and time itself, of course, will be a theme that I hope we'll touch upon. But the questions of communication, isolation, consciousness, and in particular, the theme of a new beginning, because in the piece, of course, you will remember, those of you who have seen it, the Mairuna people are responding to the circumstance that they find themselves in, a circumstance of oppression and violence, and their response is to go forward in time to a beginning. And perhaps all of us are asking not only when this will end, the lockdown and this question of COVID-19, not only asking when that will end, but also how we are going to begin again. Thank you.
Thank you, Simon. Well, it's an extraordinarily adventurous conception and beautifully realized. And it's the only play I've ever seen, actually, that works as well on the small screen as on the stage. And that in itself is miraculous. And after we've got through some of the other things, we may want to go back to that. But let's now go on to your responses to the play. And I think, Charlotte, tell us a little, how you digested this.
Well, the thing that really struck me immediately was that how you are immersed in this soundscape and experience. And I think that was one of the most striking things. You're thrown in, it's as if you were actually thrown in to the forest. And there's ideas and sounds, and you're kind of discombobulated, and we're in this very dramaturgical experience. So you're not separate from what you're actually experiencing, which I think is one of the things that comes through on the play, is that the two things that really that we're in crisis about is that we are totally separated, one from each other as kin, and two, from the non-human world that is here represented by the forest and its beings. And I think the two things that struck me also about that was time and the need to let go of a story. There's a lot of conversation about shift of consciousness, let's have a new narrative, let's start again. But in many ways, we have to undo the story that we're part of in order to get to a new way of being. And that is shown in the performance where everything was burned. And also where he loses his watch, because he gets all that clock time goes out, and he's thrust into ancestral time. And ancestral time is related by our mythologies, which lives under our linear time. And in many ways, I feel that we are stuck in this linear time like a merry-go-round that goes really fast. And we don't know how to get off that. It's fueled by the fossil fuel industry, by lots of other things. And we get onto it, and it's really wild, and we grab, and we think it's life, but it's not life. Life is the planet, and life is central to what we're about, not human beings and our civilization. So for me, the play throws you into all those, throws you deeply into that existential territory where you ask, what are we doing? How can we get back to being human beings on the planet together? Is that possible? So I think the very physical relationship that we have with this play, because we're listening. We're not dominated by our eyes, even though Simon's moving all over the stage. We're actually listening, and that's the thing that I find it very poignant, that it starts and ends with a child who asks, "Daddy, can you tell me a story?" Because children know that the real knowledge comes through listening to story, particularly at night in the dark. That's how we learn how to be human and how to connect. So anyway, those are the few things that came up for me when I watched it.
Thank you, that's brilliant. Paul, will you take that thread on, listening to stories at night?
Listening to stories, and I'm really struck that when Simon first invited me to go with him on the journey, where we went to meet the Mayaruna, the first journey, and then to the Xingu, where we met Takuman, that as you can probably imagine with Simon, it was very much about storytelling. Simon told stories, he heard stories, which was even more important. And Charlotte used that beautiful phrase about time of transition. And from the moment that Simon made the invitation, really I was in a moment of transition. I'd been working for 25 years in Brazil at that time, and mainly making work between artists in prisons and favelas. But for all those years, I'd never really met any indigenous people. And Simon said he wanted to come out and he wanted to make a journey. He wanted to meet some indigenous people, preferably the Mayaruna, which was difficult because Simon's time is very limited. So we had to sort of find a way that we could meet them outside of the deepest Amazon in which they still live today. And Simon and I made that journey by plane, by motorbike, by car, truck, and then to the canoes on the river, where we went up to the Mayaruna village of Marajai. And as we arrived, there were more people taking photographs of Simon and Gareth and the rest of the Complicité crew than there were of us taking photographs of them. And somehow in that moment, that sort of mutual gaze, what I love about this show is that Simon's managed to keep that sense of not just us looking at Indigenous people, but the way to activate that sense in the way in which they look at us. And I think that, you know, nothing better to see that in Takuman's presence 6 years later, and it is now 6 years since that journey started. He's here today, we're still talking, and we need to be hearing and listening to Takuman as much as to the Mairuna people and to the other Indigenous peoples in Brazil, now more than ever. And when I think about the stories, I remember in that first visit when we were with the Mairuna in the Marajari, we walked towards the head man, the cacique, and Simon was with the, that head that you see on stage. We were carrying the head to do the recordings. There's this extraordinary image in my head of these white Europeans carrying this dark head into the hut of this cacique and placing this head down. And then the cacique makes this long speech, which I had to translate, long speech about the Mairuna and everything. And then he turns to Simon and he says, "Why are you here?" And there's this moment where Simon does one of his incredible pauses, and I'm translating and thinking, he's not going to say anything. And of course, it's that question, why are you here, which goes to the heart of it. I think every time we meet Indigenous people, certainly for me meeting in all these encounters over the last 6 years, as part of this project and others, that why are you here? Because their very existence seems to be impossible. How, when 96% of the Indigenous peoples in Brazil have been destroyed by European genocide, how is it possible that they are still here? How is Takuman here with us today? Who is he? What is he doing? So his presence asks questions of us. And I think that's what's great about the encounter. It forces us to question some of the deepest things about ourselves, not least picking up on what Charlotte's saying, those questions about how can we not have learnt that if we hurt nature, we will hurt ourselves? Those questions that that Simon returned to again and again in those visits, about listening to nature, about listening to these stories and finding a way that we can be looking at each other.
Thank you. Takuma, would you like to give us your response to the play and how you see these various elements that you were part of initially being transformed into this production?
Takuma, dá para conversar pouco sobre como este encontro com Simon realmente afetou você e como você desenvolveu esta relação entre vocês dois, até para ver a peça que foi a transformação deste material para você no teatro, suas histórias na boca, no palco do Barbican.
Então, essa peça é muito importante para todo mundo conhecer como é a importância de natureza, como é a importância de aonde nós estamos vivendo, né, hoje em dia, né? Aonde eu moro realmente, na terra de Xingu, eu acho que a peça representa realmente a importância do natureza, mato, aonde nós estamos vivendo, né? Isso que eu tinha entendido durante a peça, onde eu vi realmente, assim, pessoalmente, ele representando o homem dentro do mato, né? Porque você sente realmente como nós sentimos aqui.
So I sat in the Barbican, and what I got from this play was that it shows us the importance of nature. It shows us the importance. Simon shows our world. He shows us man in relation to nature. So when I saw it, that's what came to me, that Simon had managed to make us listen to nature and to see where he lives and how he lives.
Porque o homem que fica dentro do mato, realmente, como nós vivemos aqui, porque ele sente a importância daquela natureza, porque quando a gente fica aqui dentro do natureza, a gente pescando naturalmente, indo na roça, indo tomando banho no rio, nós sentimos naquele momento, né? Nós sentimos com aquilo, né? Aqui, pessoalmente mesmo, assim. quem não conhece natureza, quem nunca andou de natureza, assim, aquela pessoa pode achar muito estranho. Na verdade, aquele fortalece nossa alma, aquele fortalece nossos espíritos. A gente está conectado com a natureza, porque um homem que está dentro do mato, se sentindo com o pernilongo, né? Pernilongo cheio de... Você ouvindo, escutando aquele pernilongo, aquilo ali realmente... Nós estamos sentindo isso, à noite sentimos isso, em madrugada sentimos isso, durante nossa pescaria sentimos isso. Eu acho que importância nisso, muito... deixa eu terminar só com essa palavra. Eu acho que é importante mostrar realmente a força da natureza com essa peça.
So when you're sitting in the theatre and you hear that insect buzzing in your ear, you are like us. We are in the center of that forest. It's not about the forest, it's about people and the forest and our relationship with it. And the play places you in the center of that world of nature. So we are in that world of nature. We are of that world of nature. We go and fish naturally. We plant. We eat what we plant within our village. We're in our village is in that forest. And the play places you, when you are listening to those sounds, you hear those sounds that we hear in our world.
Simon, I want to come back to you and ask you what the point of genesis of this encounter, this idea of this encounter was. Because, here you have a Westerner who is very much like many of us in this room, in the Zoom room too, I imagine, who is tied to time, who is tied to his camera, and perhaps even more now than when the play was made, when the production was made. And you have him go through this, these stages really of what we would call a breakdown. I mean, he is moving into a different part of himself, and whether he'll come out the other side is always a worry. It may not happen. A little like us in lockdown now. Tell us.
Well, what you say is apposite, because I started with questions which were concerning me from many years ago. There was about 20 years ago, I worked and created a piece with several others called Mnemonic, which was about memory. As a consequence of that, I found myself asking more and more questions about consciousness. So because I was interested in the biochemistry of memory and also memory as identity and how those two things interacted, I also became fascinated with the consciousness of, this thing, I'm inside this skin sack and I call myself Simon McBurney, but why is Simon McBurney here and not over there? And why other people are not Simon McBurney, or why you, Lisa, are called Lisa, and what separates us? That, of course, led me into very strange dreams. And of course, we all have our own personal little breakdowns and disturbances and queries. And as a theatre maker, I've always tried to take questions which concern me and work them out on stage. So, for example, I made a piece about mathematics because I never really understood mathematics. But here, the genesis began a long time ago with a question of my own identity, feeling feeling as if I am separated from something and I don't quite know how to articulate that. I don't know why I feel uneasy or other people around me feel uneasy. I don't understand this sense of time or how I feel sort of, why should I be overly worried about my own mortality? I mean, dozens of sort of tumbling questions. So as I was working on the questions of consciousness, I started thinking, well, how can I put other people through the experience of what I'm experiencing? And so I've always been interested, what is this mystery that goes on here inside our heads, which is so complex? And what is the relationship with the outside world? Is it real what we see, or is it not real? How do we describe it? Why do we use words? How do we communicate with each other? And so at the same time as I was thinking about these issues, I was given some 35 years ago by Annie Castledown, a colleague and friend, this book, Amazon Beaming by Petru Popescu. And I didn't really think it was stageable. But as I started thinking about consciousness, I also was thinking about stories. And like many people, I read Sapiens by Noah Yuval Harari, and I became fascinated with his understanding of stories. And then I started talking to all sorts of different people about consciousness, about stories, about listening. And why did I make this? I didn't know what I was doing. It provides the means in which I have been trying to, if you like, tease out, turn over all these questions which were going on inside my head. That was, slightly incoherently, the genesis.
I remember you said, perhaps it was even yesterday, that when you talk to Takuma about stories, he says the stories always come from out there. They're not stories from in here. And I wonder whether he would like to comment about what the difference is, and is there a difference between the out there and the in here? Paul, could you?
See, just to explain to other people, Takuma is able to follow the conversation because he's getting most of it translated on chat, so he knows what's happening. But Takuma, Simon está voltando para aquela questão sobre histórias que você falou para ele na semana passada, que a história não vem de dentro da gente, vem de fora. Pode falar um pouco sobre isso?
Então, falando sobre história, do nosso história realmente, né? Ele vem de natureza mesmo, ele vem tem vários tipos de história, assim, porque a gente não cria história, né? História vem do passado, a gente não pode inventar história, a gente já existe muito tempo história, a gente vem contando isso de geração em geração. O meu avô contava história, minha mãe, depois minha mãe contou história, meu pai contaram história, tudo vem contando história, porque a gente não cria a própria nossa história, já vem muito tempo nossa história.
We don't create stories. We just don't create stories. They are outside of us. They come from nature. They come from my ancestors. The stories I have are the stories my grandmother told my mother, who told me. We don't invent our own stories. They come from outside of us, and whether they come from our grandfathers or whether our mothers, or whether they come from the world that's outside of us, the forest, the spirits, the plants.
Charlotte, you've worked a lot with myth and thinking about how myths actually relate to our everyday lives. And in a sense, I mean, we too work with the material that comes to us from, ancestors, i.e. myths. What do you think? Do you think there's a huge difference?
I think the thing is that we like to tell stories about ourselves as human beings, and we put ourselves on a pedestal, and that's what I would call linear storytelling. But the kind of storytelling that Takuma is talking about and comes up in the encounter are myths, which are the stories we don't write. You know, I mean, you and I are writers, we like writing stories, but we do not invent these ones. They are passed on, and as you know, they come from the non-human world, and they come from our ancestors, and they're passed. They're ancient. They're thousands of years old, and we've been telling them in different ways. Each generation retells some of these stories, and we might say, "Oh, well, we don't have a connection to the ancestors, as you know, in our modern civilization." But actually, they're there in the fairy tales. They're there in the Greek myths. You know, they're always there. And I think one of the extraordinary tasks really for artists and writers and performers now is to be the rememberers of those kinds of myths that can help us make these our own rituals, if you like, our own performances, so we can get back to what it's like to be properly human and in touch with our forests and our mountains and our rivers again, because there's a great desire for us to have that kinship. And one of the things I think has been really interesting about the pandemic is that two things really. One is that sense of empathy, because we stopped, because time did something weird. It's done something weird, but we've stopped, that merry-go-round has stopped a bit. And we've reached out, even though we were in lockdown, we've been reaching out to our fellows. And also we've been listening to the birds in a way that, and the animals have been coming into the cities. And so our attention is very, very different. And I think that's coming from a desire to actually be different kinds of human beings, not on this whirligig sort of linear mad history that goes around and repeats itself in a very aggressive and non-friendly way.
I think time and space have both changed. I mean, Simon, when did you find through the conceiving of this and then the doing it, the enactment of it, because you are the great maker of inner worlds through the physical embodiment of them. I mean, you're the only person who I know who does this on the stage, that you manage to physically embody the inside of the mind as well as the emotions. Did the making of this actually change your own view of things?
Yes, well, I mean, it was a very curious form of performing, because it was at the same time technical, because I was dealing with dozens of microphones. And at the same time, I had to have an absolute connection to what was going on inside. So in terms of time, I felt like sometimes I was in a kind of trance. To be able to do it, it required me to forget about the technical aspect completely. And from that, in a way, I took inspiration from my wife, who's a pianist, because her technique is unbelievable, but it's not visible. And so that's a question of sort of practice. But in terms of time, it's very, very strange because I genuinely sort of had no idea sometimes sort of the time passing while I was performing it. In terms of my own perception of things, did that change? I think in a way it heightened the sense for me of my own, as it were, the tyranny that I live under, in the sense that, I can't escape the time and the stories that I have been brought up with. I am completely brought up in a materialistic universe. And in my world, I mean, I can thrash around in it, I can complain, but I'm still very much in it. So it's not as if I myself was absolutely transformed. However, one of the things that in this particular performance, strangely, when the audience was so quiet with their headphones on, I could hardly hear them, was I felt closer to them than any other stage production I've ever done, partly because of the intimacy of the voice, but also I felt as if I could feel them listening, and I could feel that I was listening to them. And in a sense, it made me realize that stories are not about the tellers, but about those who listen.
Takuma, what's interesting to me, I mean, maybe it's just a point of curiosity, but when you saw the production, I mean, did you think that the ritual that Simon enacts, or at least from the indigenous people's point of view, it's a ritual, but he, as this character from the West, sees it as a form of terror and persecution, as well, and inner strife, as well, perhaps eventually as a ritual. Did you recognize that?
Você reconheceu esse ritual que é tão importante para você na vida da aldeia, essa coisa dos rituais? Você reconheceu lá no palco, quando Simon estava fazendo o ritual dele no palco, você reconheceu alguma coisa entre o ritual que você conhece e nosso ritual do teatro?
Então, na verdade, o teatro é um pouco diferente, né? O teatro, quando a gente representa as coisas, pouco diferente do que nosso ritual. Mas nosso ritual é como se fosse um teatro também, porque a gente dança, nós pintamos, nós fantasiamos com nossa cultura, assim, pintamos todas as coisas. Como um teatro pode ser traduzido em português teatro, mas para a gente é ritual, né? Ritual de dança, onde estamos representando vários tipos a dança dos animais, como a dança do peixe, a dança do papagaio, a dança do outros, né? Que a gente representa dentro do nosso ritual.
You may think when you look at our ritual, it's like your theatre, because we dress up and we paint our bodies and there's costumes and everything. And perhaps the word theatre and ritual, perhaps they do translate each other. It's not really what we're doing. What we're doing is the nature. It is the dance of the fish is the fish. And there is more than representation there. And so when he was sitting in the theatre and he saw Simon's rituals, he could see that it was like his rituals, but he feels that ritual and what they do as ritual is something beyond what is theatre.
No, I see that. Simon, what do you say to that? Because in fact, I, as somebody who doesn't partake of many rituals, really, apart from the ones that are self-created in the family. But when I watched your character doing the steps of the dance, I actually began to feel that he was falling into the ritual state, if you like, the state of being, which is part of that ritual.
Well, I was very privileged to participate in one of the principal rituals in the Xingu, which is the Kwarupi amongst the peoples in the Xingu, 6 years ago now, where I met Takuma. So I understand absolutely what Takuma is saying. I think that when I was dancing on stage, by that point in the show, the physical exertion of it, as it were, the difficulty of performing it, would put me in a state, if you like, whereby I wasn't really, I wasn't quite conscious in the same way. I was taken away, if you like. But I think one of the points is that about the story and about McIntyre within that stage is that he has to let go. There is a letting go. And so in the Kwarupi, that was very clear to me. It was, again, when we're talking about separation, the women, the men, the mourners, because it is principally a ritual it's a ritual of death as well as life, the mourning that takes place. There is a kind of this incredible sense of letting go. There's no separation. People go, as Takuma is describing it, into the forest, into representing the fire, into representing the birds, except it's not representation, they are, if you like. And so part of the representation for me, the ritual which happened with that particular, with the show, is that man, if you like, was lost and he had to go to the limit of being lost. And so that was my experience too, sometimes on stage.
Okay, I'd like to turn us now towards what happens in the new beginning. Let us say that we eventually move out of lockdown, or gradually move out of lockdown, but we will be in a new place because collectively we've all gone through this extraordinary experience together. Charlotte, you began by hinting at a few things that might come out the other side. Tell us a little more.
I feel in some ways the thing about lockdown was suddenly the whole planet, it seemed, every country was undergoing something at the same time, or more or less the same time. And I think in a way that was a kind of a global drama. It was already a theatre. And then a lot of us went online like we are now, sort of doing our kind of kitchen sink, as it were, theatre shows every day. And something about that hugeness and the smallness, those two very, very different senses of scale, almost feels like that's where we need to position ourselves in order to understand reality, in order to understand consciousness in a much broader way than we have. And I think partly it's opening our hearts to connect with our fellow humans and fellow non-humans, in a sense, because of the suffering that was, many people have gone through a real physical and psychological ordeal, which is already in the encounter. I mean, it is something we need to go through. If we're going to change, everybody talks about change, but we actually have to undergo it a bit, like you were saying, Simon. People have to undergo the theatre. They can't move out. We can't move out of lockdown. And I think that's led people to a space where they can really question what they're doing on the planet. And do I really need to do this job? Or do I really need to live like this? Oh, I'm having these relationships, but do I actually am I really treasuring them in the way that I can now have time to? So I think there are a lot of questions that we've asked ourselves that we wouldn't have had time to do had this lockdown not happened.
Thank you for that. Paul.
Yeah, it's been really it's been really interesting because obviously since the lockdown, since the pandemic, one of the things we've been doing is working directly. Marielle Franco, the city councillor was gunned down in Rio a couple of years ago. I think Tucumán reminds us that this is a violent society and that the violence of the gunning down of Marielle Franco or the violence against the indigenous peoples, these are all connected. They're not disconnected moments. And one of the things since the pandemic has been working with Tucumán and others who are friends of the Kwikuru and thinking about how they have come back to a collective existence that was becoming very fragmented, even though they live essentially a first millennium life. You'll see from where Tucumán is there is a transition. They are in a time of transition. That's what the Xingu is, between a life that they can connect absolutely across 1,000 years with rituals and ways of dressing and ways of eating and ways of planting and fishing and their relationship with the forest. There is an unconnected stream that they are part of. But at the same time, their young people are using Facebook, they're taking photographs, they've got internet twice for 2 hours a day. So they're in times of transitions which they are managing, but they had become very fragmented. The Tucumán, since the beginning of the pandemic, we've had very happy conversations where he's talked about how the village has come back together. There's only 800 Kwikuru people in the whole world speaking that language, doing those things together, building their houses together. And they have come back to a new state of collectivity and of return. It has been a return. But if they're going to have a future, they have to survive. And it has been, as you'll know, there's a Just Giving page associated that Complicité very kindly helps us set up to contribute. Why do they need money? Why do they need money? How have we made them dependent on money when they don't live in a society in which they exchange money? Because there are so many things that their connectivity has also been a part of a certain dependency. So it's been, these last 2 months has been revelatory, I think, for us, but certainly for Tucumán when he talks about it, about how they're discovering new things in order to go forward, just as much as we are.
Tucumán, do you want to elaborate on what you've discovered through this time of COVID and pandemic?
Então, para falar pouco sobre o que você está aprendendo sobre nesta época que a gente está neste momento da pandemia e também sobre sua experiência de isolamento, que é diferente de nós.
Então, agora eu vou falar sobre o que está acontecendo, não é só de povos indígenas, qualquer lugar do mundo que chegou, né? E o mundo está chorando, na verdade, a gente fala. O mundo está chorando, o mundo está triste, o mundo está doente. Isso que está acontecendo no qualquer lugar do mundo, né? E nós aqui na terra indígena Xingu, a gente está isolado mesmo, fazendo quarentena. Estamos realmente... não tem caso de coronavírus aqui na aldeia ainda. Tem 16 povos indígenas aqui no Xingu, não tem ainda essa doença dentro da terra indígena Xingu, mas já está chegando, aproximando nossa terra indígena Xingu. Já está como se fosse agronegócio. Agronegócio já está em volta da terra indígena Xingu, o vírus está em volta do Xingu também agora. A gente está com medo com isso, estamos com medo de chegar até dentro da aldeia.
This is not about indigenous people. The world is crying. All around the world, it is crying. This is about pain and violence that the world is experiencing. We are all experiencing it together. Here in the Xingu, we have isolated in our village, but as he said to Simon last week, isolation and exclusion is something that's part of their rituals, part of their culture. But now they have a new experience. They see the pandemic as being like the toxic agriculture that brings soya to the edge of the Xingu. They are surrounded by a virus that is not just this virus, but the viruses of the modern way of life, which destroys the forest, which makes it impossible, will make it impossible for them to live their lives. Takuma.
Então, como eu sou do povo cuicuro, né? Tem vários povos aqui no Xingu. Tem Calapalo, Matipu, Nafuá, Javalapiti, Camaiurá, Uaurá e outros povos em Caiabi. A gente não está... todo mundo pensa diferente dos outros, né? Nós aqui do povo, eu posso falar diretamente do meu povo, né? Estamos se organizando, tentando que a gente pode respeitar realmente esse isolamento, para ninguém sair para a cidade, ninguém entrar também aqui na aldeias. Estamos com muito medo, a gente vê notícia através de redes sociais, de televisão, as coisas, né? E estamos muito com medo com as coisas que estão acontecendo e, ao mesmo tempo, estamos fortalecendo própria nossa história, nossa cultura, nossa realidade mesmo aqui na aldeia. Estamos conectando nossa cultura, porque ele era muito fraco, porque cada um viajava, cada um indo para lá, fazendo suas coisas. Durante o nosso isolamento, estamos fortalecendo nossa ritual, nossa cotidiano aqui mesmo dentro da nossa aldeia.
We are scared, but we are stronger because we are now together. We have taken this opportunity of this lockdown, of this pandemic, to rebuild our culture, to re-strengthen those links that were starting to get fragmented. I want to say to you that we are 16 different peoples, different nations within the Xingu territories. We are all, he listed all the beautiful names of their tribes, of the different peoples. We are all different. The virus has not yet got into the Xingu. There are no cases yet. So all of them are taking different steps. They're not all the same. They're all doing different things. But for him, he wants to say from his people that they are using this opportunity to rebuild, to be stronger, to be able to go into this future as the Kwikuru people with their rituals, their everyday rituals, stronger than when this started.
Thank you so much for that, because, you know, I feel in a way that there are aspects of our lives too which are stronger because of this stage of lockdown, but also other things which are still very, very frightening. And one of them, I want Simon to give us a big story of this before we turn to questions. But one of them is simply that we've had a kind of time of enforced intimacy where families are with their children, small and larger. And that's meant that we have to listen to one another, just as you listen to your daughter in the play, who interrupts rituals, who interrupts anything in order to have her story time and her daddy. And I thought that was wonderful. To me, it was the real point of another kind of learning as well. So Simon, tell us, what of this post-COVID moment? What are we to look to?
Well, I think we are very conscious of time now, because there is a before the COVID and there's after it, because it's been a very intense experience. It is still an intense experience. It's not over. We don't know what's going to happen next. The important thing, I don't mean to say the important thing, but it has had an effect on us. And the question for me is exactly what you've just said. Can we even listen to that experience? Can we listen to ourselves as well as listening to each other? Understanding as a consequence, as what Charlotte says, that we suddenly have a very powerful image of us together as a planet. And the remarkable thing, as I'm looking at, on the screen here, I'm being sent messages to say that there are people who are also listening to this discussion in Borneo and the Philippines, in Argentina, in Brazil, in Chicago, in many, many different places in the world. We are reminded, I think, perhaps of it's a cliched expression, of a common humanity. And what is extraordinary, and I suppose the thing that I was searching for in the play, is this connection between the most intimate part of ourselves, the most intimate of my connections, which is with my daughter, and how with my children, how do I exchange? How is my story being heard? And how am I listening to her? In other words, what is this continual connection? And that this most intimate of connections is also the same connection which allows us a sense of compassion and understanding between all of us in the world. But that isn't just between human beings. But what I learned, if you like, certainly through an ongoing relationship and collaboration with Takuma and many other indigenous artists, is that this also is a connection with listening outside of ourselves to everything that is around us. Listening near is the same as listening far. And there's a curious metaphor, isn't there? Because we are suddenly listening and aware of people on the front line who are engaged in a struggle to help us with our survival. The NHS, for example, in Britain, the care workers, the people who are cleaning the hospitals, who've had to go in. We are suddenly aware of the people who are right at what we might have called the edges of society, not just the politicians. And at the same time, that metaphor extends into the Amazon, because Takuma's people and the people, all the peoples of the Amazon, in fact, all the peoples who live in forests all over the world and elsewhere, the people at Standing Rock are engaged, they are front line, they're in the front line of the struggle to minister to the health of the planet. It is for good reason that the Amazon is called the lungs of the planet. 1/5 of the world's fresh water is found in the Amazon basin, if you like, every 5th glass you drink. And so perhaps this is something which we can take forward and begin to listen to those voices which are not heard right at the edges of our world. Because if we do, we can possibly imagine a new future.
Thank you for that, Simon. I've got questions here, but I'm very new to this technology, and I'm not sure I'm going to get all of them, but I will try. So first question, what does listening mean to you, and how does it relate to understanding and embodying different conceptions of time, linear, ancestral, etc.? I think we've covered some of that.
But can we translate that for Takuma, because then maybe he can...
Ele está perguntando quando você fala de escutar a natureza, ou escutar fora de você, o mundo fora de você, que representa escutar para você? Quando você está escutando, o que é?
And time, Paul.
E esta questão de tempo, como é tempo para você?
Então, a gente escuta a voz de natureza, né? A voz de alguns pássaros, né? e para a gente sinal de as coisas que vai acontecer também, as coisas negativas, as coisas positivas que pode acontecer com a voz de pássaros, onde a gente escuta as coisas. Escutamos, tem um pássaro que pode te avisar que como se fosse mensageiro do natureza, que ele pode te avisar que alguém no outra aldeia que está acontecendo alguma coisa, sua família está acontecendo alguma coisa. Isso que acontece a fala dos pássaros para a gente aqui. Escutamos isso, sentimos.
We have to listen. We have to listen to the messengers. We have to listen to the messengers of nature. So, for example, we need to listen to the birds, because it's the birds that will tell us that in another village something is happening, and they will pass it on to us, so we will be able to hear. We've got to learn to listen to these messages that come to us from nature. E o tempo, tá como este conceito que você tem do tempo dentro do povo Kwikuru, do povo xinguano.
Então, o nosso tempo, né, mudou agora, na verdade, durante o nosso isolamento. Mudou porque nosso tempo agora é muito fechado mesmo aqui dentro da nossa aldeia. Ele pode... Porque o nosso tempo agora realmente... Porque antes a gente não tinha tempo, na verdade, porque todo mundo viajava, né? Não tinha tempo que a gente pratica a própria nossa cultura, nossa cotidiano aqui. Nosso tempo, durante nosso quarentena, nosso isolamento aqui, ele está realmente, estamos fazendo próprio nossa, como é que eu posso dizer assim, nós estamos curtindo própria nossa cultura através do nosso tempo, mas claro que mudou nosso tempo também aqui, né? Mudou muito pela mudança climática também. Mudança climática, não temos próprio nosso calendário certo, não temos calendário dos como os nossos avós falavam para a gente, tal certo, a chuva vai começar, tal dia certo, a chuva vai terminar.
Climate change has changed our sense of time, because time used to come from nature. When the rains fall, when the rivers rise, we could tell when we would plant, we knew the rhythms of our life. Time was in nature. But there is something about the pandemic that's given us time back. Time seems to have been returned to us. We'd lost time. We didn't have time. We were dashing around and they were flying around. We had no time. None of us had time. And suddenly we've got time back.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that. I don't know if anybody wants to take up any other aspect of that. Yes.
I'd just like to say something about listening, is that I find real listening is not just about listening with your head. You know, you listen with your body, because the voice or the sound of the birds or the wind in the trees, it's all physical, and you feel it in your body. And the reason I feel time is important, because in order to listen like that, you have to have time. You know, you need to have patience. You need to wait. You need to tune in a very different way. You know, our culture, a lot of the time, it's going really fast, and it's all words, and it's all thoughts, and the mind's going around like that. But if you want to be in nature and to hear nature and to listen to the trees, you have to kind of go down and feel connected to the roots and feel connected to the, you know, to the wind. And that's a very different kind of listening.
Thank you for that. There's another question here, which is, how do you think this pandemic will change how we tell stories in the future? Simon, I'm going to come to you on that.
I have absolutely no idea, because we're still in it. I mean, look at us here. We're telling a different kind of story. There are currently more than 800 people watching us talk. This is quite a new form of story. It isn't new in the sense it's been going on for a while, but it's new that everybody is participating in it. I don't know. I mean, how do you tell stories unless you've got people who are listening? How do you tell stories unless people are close to you? And this is the question. It's all about proximity. But I think there is, what is very interesting is, just as Takuma was talking about getting time back, one of the aspects that a lot of people have commented on is the fact that they suddenly are aware of the people around them, whether positively or negatively. But a lot of people have become aware of the communities that they live in, and the creation of stories is also a question of community, because it's about the narrative that you create yourself. I don't know what it means in terms of theatre. Don't ask me that. I have no idea what's going to happen. You can't have, I mean, there's only point in doing a theatre if the theatre is full, you know, because it is about all these people coming together. My father, who was an archaeologist, used to say that as it were, the audience in the theatre is the same scale as a human community. So be it a hamlet, let's say 50 people, a village, 100, 200 people, a small town, up to about 2,000 people. And if you're in Epidavros, it was about a third of the population of Athens, which was a city. So it's always addressing a community. And it is about, you know, they say that a theatre audience, there's been research done where they say that a theatre audience, people's hearts start to beat in unison. So that is, a story is also in some way about connection and community.
I write stories on the page, of course, and that's rather different, because you don't have an immediate listener stroke reader. There's always a time lag. And of course, they do also complete the stories for you when you hear back from them, but you don't know that in the very physical way that you do in a theatre. There's a very interesting...
Your stories go out in the world. They're nomadic. And once you've finished it, well, I mean, who knows what people are going to do with it? Or, you know...
Anything.
Yes.
Okay. Oh, Charlotte, did you want to add to that? No, I'm sorry. I thought you'd raised your hand. I have another question here, which is really interesting, and it says there seems to be a difference between spectacle and ritual. We in the so-called developed world live largely in spectacle. Who could possibly be our shamans leading us to our own beginning? Difficult question.
Well, perhaps it would be, Takuma, I would love to hear you talking a little, deepening that theme that you brought up before about the relationship between spectacle and ritual, if you could perhaps translate, Paul.
Então, é uma pergunta sobre a diferença entre esta coisa de uma forma espetacular que você assiste e o ritual, que você faz parte daquele ritual. E então, Simon, gostou muito do que você falou sobre essa coisa de teatro e ritual. Como é esse ritual, que é diferente de nosso conceito de espetáculo que a gente assiste ou escuta?
Então, o teatro, ele pode ser imaginação das pessoas também, né? Isso é diferença também eu entendo assim pessoalmente, né? E que você pode criar também. Você pode criar a cena, você pode criar as coisas, mas você está seguindo aquele livro, né? Alguma coisa escrita pelo outros, né? Outro escreveu, né? Que você pode imaginar as coisas através dessa escrito, né? Que você pode criar, né? Na verdade, nosso ritual não é realmente pelo escrito, né? Nosso ritual vem do nossa história mesmo, própria nossa história. A gente vem praticando muito tempo. A gente não vai mudar isso daqui futuramente. Vai existir o mesmo ritmo, a mesma pintura, o mesmo canto, e porque teatro, diferente de teatro, ele pode ser que você pode criar outro daqui futuramente. Que você pode porque nosso ritual, entre diferença com teatro, com o ritual dos povos indígenas, do povo aqui do Xingu mesmo, que eu falo do meu povo, a gente não muda nosso ritual, nossa pintura, ele vai existir o tempo todo. mas ele é tudo conectado com como se fosse no teatro, mas é do próprio do povo daqui do Xingu, do Alto Xingu, no povo Cuicuro, veio da nossa história. Tudo nosso ritual, pinturas, cantos, temos história.
The difference is that ritual has always existed. It exists. It's there. We just redo it, and we can, and therefore through that we connect. When Simon and when all of you make spectacle or theatre, what you need is imagination. You've got to imagine to create. You may have a book or you may have a play. You've got to imagine that and to create that and to interpret it. That's not what we do. Ritual is there. We do it, but it already exists. It's there, and in the redoing it, we make it. And that is how we connect. And it's the redoing of that ritual that connects us. He feels that's very different from what a spectacle or the source of where it comes from.
I just wanted to say that there's a wonderful phrase by John Berger who says that the heart of theatre is a sense of ritual return. So within theatre, I would say, Takuma, there is also a sense of ritual. It could be an echo of it, but essentially, you know, if I do the encounter, I do it over and over. It's the same thing. And before I go on stage, I make my own prayers to the gods of the theatre and to whatever gods exist, because it is the same thing. And I have to live through it. If I don't live through it, people see, as it were, its the falsity of its nature. If you could translate that for him.
Então, ele tem alguma coisa em teatro que é esse ritual, porque como John Berger, que é grande escritor, que é amigo de Simon, muito influencia o trabalho dele, você tem, através do teatro, uma volta ao ritual. Cada noite, Simon faz ritual. Ele reza para os deuses de teatro, ele reza para os deuses que seja, e ele tem que entrar, ele tem que viajar naquele ritual, e tem que ser real, ele tem que ser presente naquele ritual que ele cria todas as noites no palco, porque senão tudo vai parecer falso. Então ele sente uma conexão com o seu sentido de ritual e o tipo de teatro que Simon cria.
Sim, eu entendo realmente isso. Mas, sim, uma teatro, né, que eu falo, teatro é que você está representando a força de natureza, né, que eu falo assim, espírito de natureza, que como Simon, né, que ele representa a Amazônia e dentro do mar, dentro disso, né, que ele está representando homem do mato, né, homem que se perdeu dentro do mato. E então a gente aqui que vem do nosso como é que eu posso dizer assim, como é que eu posso dizer, ele vem do nosso criador, né, próprio, que a gente acredita, né, a gente fala Taungui, né, Taungui que a gente fala, vem ele que ensinou nossos antepassados, né? O Sol e a Lua, né? O Sol e a Lua que fez para a gente poder representar essa ritual, né?
He agrees with you. He agrees with you that he sees when you're on stage, you are representing. You are representing nature. He sees you represent the man in nature. He saw in the theatre that you did all that. Just this difference that he still feels, which is that when they go on that stage, it comes from the moon, it comes from the sun, it comes from the stars, whatever you want to call their God, it comes from the creator, not the creation from them.
Yes.
But Paul, if you could translate for me, what's interesting to me is that Kuma has decided to be a filmmaker, which is precisely the most spectacular of forms, and yet he's talking about this immersion and everything coming from the outside within ritual and his own indigenous way of life. So why film?
Então, por que cineasta? Por que você está fazendo filme? Porque isso parece totalmente o contrário do ato de ritual, que vem de... porque teatro cinema é totalmente de fora, filmando de fora, não é imersão.
Então, eu vou falar agora sobre meu trabalho, realmente. Então, como a gente fala, né, muito no mundo inteiro tem muito brancos aproximando a gente, né? A gente fala assim, antigamente não pensava branco, agora a gente pensa duas coisas. Nosso pensamento duas coisas agora, né? Todo mundo está estudando, tem professores indígenas, tem agentes de saúde, tem as pessoas que estão trabalhando várias áreas indígenas dentro da aldeia. Isso mudou muito nossa vida, nosso cotidiano dentro da aldeia, porque nossos pais, nossos avós não pensavam isso. Eles não falavam que eu vou trabalhar como médico, eu vou trabalhar como advogado, eu vou ser motorista de alguém, eu vou ser, sei lá, empregador de alguém, eu vou trabalhar, sei lá, na cidade, estudando na cidade. Isso não existia antes. Hoje em dia, nosso pensamento mudou. Nova tecnologia chegou dentro da aldeia. Isso mudando a aldeia.
So, it's because of you, white people. So all non-Indigenous people, for them, are white, regardless. It's the whiteness. And because of you, they now have to live with two minds, two consciousnesses. So they now have to exist on that double consciousness. One, because their ancestors didn't have to work for anyone else. They weren't drivers, they weren't employed, didn't become medics. But all their young people now do go to schools. They have an indigenous health service as well as their own rituals and beliefs of their health. So they're living this double consciousness because of white people.
Ok.
Então, isso mudou nosso cotidiano, né, realmente aqui, e jovens, né, e nosso pensamento agora é estudar. Isso está acabando com a própria nossa cultura, nossa história. Para isso, eu, como cineasta, documentarista, pesquisador indígena através da audiovisual, que eu junto com a comunidade do cacique e outros, documentamos tudo nossa história, os cantos, para que as pessoas possam aprender através disso. Mas a gente já temos mais de 600 documentados, nossa própria história do povo cuicuro. Temos centros de documentação na aldeia, onde nós podemos arquivar a própria nossa história, nós estamos fazendo isso, para que as pessoas possam aprender através de nossa imagem, porque nós entendemos a própria nossa história, nós entendemos a sequência de nossa história, nosso ritual. Por isso que eu, como cineasta, eu estou registrando tudo o que está acontecendo, porque nova tecnologia, a gente fala assim, cheiro de branco, né? Influência do branco muito forte dentro da aldeia. Isso está acabando.
So because we can now smell white people in our village, cheiro do branco, the smell of whiteness, because we can now smell that whiteness, that's why we have to make films, and we have to make those films. He describes himself not as a filmmaker, but as a researcher. And he describes himself, he said it right at the beginning, he is a filmmaker with his village. He makes films with his village. They've made over 600 documentary films just about their village, because there's not enough to know the story. You have to know the sequence of a story to be able to tell a story. They are the only ones who know that sequence, how it's told and what it means. So they need to film themselves. So the reason he's a filmmaker, researcher with his village is because of that double consciousness, and because he has to now document that. And he's speaking to you from actually their center of documentation. And the reason it's made out of brick when the rest of the village is made out of straw and wood is simply because they got to preserve that documentation of those lives and those rituals and that culture.
Thank you so much for that. I'm aware that we're running out of time, so I'm going to take one very, very quick last round, and it's to answer this very important question. What can we do as we white people, some of us in any case, as members of the public, to put pressure on Bolsonaro and others to change their attitude to the indigenous peoples of the Amazon, who are guardians of the world's lungs? Okay, who'd like to go first? I mean, is this purely a question for Takuna again, or Simon? Why don't you? No, I'll let you go last. Takuna, what can we do?
Então, Takuna, o que a gente pode fazer em frente deste Bolsonaro? O que nós, os brancos, possam fazer? O que vocês
então, como eu mesmo pessoalmente sempre falo, assim, antes dessa pandemia, antes desse nosso muita gente morrendo, e já existia vírus no Brasil, porque Bolsonaro já era vírus do Brasil. Vírus para a gente é Bolsonaro aqui no Brasil, nosso Brasil, né? Eu posso dizer desse jeito. E ele que está mais doido do que outras pessoas, eu acho. Não sei, pessoalmente eu acho isso, né? E por isso que porque todo mundo acha que indígena já nasce com auxílio do governo. Na verdade, a gente, se tivesse isso, o governo dando salário para os cada indígena, a gente estaria num paraíso, que eu falo, a gente estaria rico nesse mundo, né? Não é isso que muita gente fala, que indígena já recebe com a ajuda do governo. Na verdade, não é isso, porque estamos aqui lutando como cada um de vocês, como cada um está trabalhando. Por isso que precisamos apoio de cada uma das pessoas, por isso que já fazemos essa campanha para que ninguém saia da aldeia daqui, né? Daqui da aldeia, porque precisamos, porque aqui na nossa aldeia não temos supermercado para a gente poder alimentar próprio nossos filhos, para a gente ir lá comprar as coisas. Não temos comércio nas nossas aldeias, porque a gente precisa pescar no mato, pescar muito longe. Por isso que lançamos essa campanha, quem puder contribuir para a gente, isso é importante.
So, Bolsonaro is the virus before the virus, and that he is the madness that has been unleashed on the world. That's what he thinks. And that's what we have to fight against. Why do they need support? Because in many respects, they shouldn't need support. They need support actually because of what we've done to their world. So why do they need diesel for outboard motors to go and fish further away than they used to fish? Because that river is now more polluted because of things that happen upriver. Because they have different dependencies now and a different life. They don't have commerce and supermarkets and shops, but they need certain things in order to live the life that double consciousness has left them with. So they have needs now. That's why they've launched this funding campaign. That's why it's so great that Complicité has really backed that, why people are giving to it. So on one level, what can people do? That's one thing they need to survive. And them and other indigenous people in Brazil, they do need this moment to have the support of people outside of their village while they are staying in it and staying protected.
Thank you so much for that. I'm afraid we've really run out of time, that thing that we're not supposed to have anymore and that we're supposed to get rid of, but we have run out of it, so we have to go. Simon, last word to you, quickly.
Yes. I think that we have to come out of this, again, I would say, listening. And there's been so many things, to be honest, that I haven't heard Takuma say before. Thank you, Takuma. Obrigado, Takuma. And I think this is a really, really, so there are two things. There are intimate lives, what you were saying, Lisa, the community of your family, and then there is the things that you send out to the world, or perhaps your relationship with the outside world, the larger society. And then I was thinking about what Charlotte was saying about this relationship between myth. There's so many things I want to ask you, Charlotte, and I'm sorry we've run out of time, but this relationship with deep story and the stories that were occupying. But one of the things that I found very, very striking that Takuma was talking about was this double consciousness. And talking about the fact that, that they have one consciousness in the white world and another in their world. But it occurs to me that we all have a double consciousness in the sense that we are, in fact, imprisoned in a narrative, all of us, Lisa, Simon, Paul, Charlotte, and Takuma, of course, but in a different way. We are imprisoned in a narrative, if you like, which, of course, we have grown up in. And one of the things that you do, Lisa, and I know that Charlotte does, and if you sense, you know, in the theatre, we are constantly asking questions of that narrative by producing narratives of our own, saying, you know, what is this? What is going on? And that is in our, if you like, so there is an attention to our intimate inner lives in a consciousness of what are we missing? What are we missing truly? What do we require? What do we want? And at the same time, when we're thinking about the questions of Bolsonaro, this other virus, if you like, it's a question of how do we resist? And part of that is, of course, communicating with those closest to us and gradually and listening to those voices further away, particularly, as we've heard today, those voices from Takuma and other people on the edges of our world. And perhaps that in itself is a form of resistance when we become conscious, again, that we are struggling for a common humanity with, this is not an elsewhere far away anymore. It is part of us. The lungs of the planet, they are our lungs. This is all of our stories. We are engaged in a common story, and therefore we must also all engage in a common resistance.
Thank you, Simon. I think coming out of COVID with that is a very good place to go. Thank you to all our panelists. Thank you to all of you out there for being here, and to the wonderful Théâtre Complicité for making all of this possible. Goodbye.
Bye.
Thank you.
And thank you for listening, everybody, wherever you are. Borneo, the Philippines, Chicago, I've got a list here. Bordeaux, Birmingham, Yorkshire, Sweden, Dublin, Manila, Chicago, Borneo, Portugal, Argentina, Greece, Colorado, Ottawa. There's just a few of those places.
Está entendendo, Takuma? Todos esses lugares que está escutando você da aldeia Táxi hoje à tarde.
It's a question of many consciousnesses here.
Yeah, and thank you for everybody who's made this possible. There's a whole army of people.
Vocês também.
But goodbye.
Thank you to everyone.
Thank you for your questions too.
Obrigado, muito obrigado.
Yes,
Obrigado.
I'm sorry.
Takuma, pode desligar.
Charlotte, thank you so much.
My pleasure.
And Lisa. And
Ciao, ciao. Thank you very much.
Ciao.
Ciao. Ciao, ciao.
I think.
Are we supposed to leave the room?
Yeah, we didn't talk about the endings, did we? Only the beginnings.
If the others are coming back or not.
Oh, Jacques Domino?
No. You see the four of you.
Apparently they can still see us.
Oh, we didn't say anything terrible then.
No, no.